My name is Travis Faske. I'm an extension plant pathologist for the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. And today, my co-presenter is Dr. John Mueller, who is a field crops nematologist with Clemson University. And today, we're going to talk about some of our experience and expertise in corn nematodes and their management. Corn nematodes are estimated to cause 60 to 70 million bushels in yield loss each year in the U.S. and Canada. Certainly an impactful pathogen on corn. Um, they're often referred to as the hidden enemies. In any given cornfield, there can be several and millions of actually plant parasitic nematodes feeding on corn. And even though corn may look normal, maybe good or fair as far as production goes, there can be yield losses due to these plant parasitic nematodes. So today we're going to talk about some of the corn nematodes that are probably most important in the U.S., how to sample for those, and as well as some of the management options that are out there. And with that, John's going to get us started with one of the images he has from South Carolina.
Thanks, Travis. This is my home, my farm here at the experiment station, the Edisto Research and Education Center. We're about an hour south of Columbia. But I wanted to show this for two reasons. One is on the right, we've used telone, a high rate of telone, to get good nematode control. And then on the left is no nematode control at all. So you can see nematodes have the potential to really stunt corn. Now, in our case, the other reason I wanted to show you this is that soil is as sandy as it looks. That field is at 80 to 85% coarse textured sand. And many of the nematodes that cause the biggest problems on corn are almost restricted to these really sandy soils. Now, there's also nematode species that are common in less sandy soils. But this is where we have our biggest problems. And you can see it's a struggle for us just to keep water in this field. I'm really pleased that we're doing this presentation today because I have worked on nematodes in the field for over 30 years. I started out with soybean, and then we added corn cotton nematodes. And these really dominated the scene for, I think, the first 20 years I was working. Of course, there was huge damage on soybean, especially from root knot. That got an awful lot of attention, and then soybean cyst nematode. And then in cotton, we've struggled and struggled with root knot nematode and with reniform nematode. And now we have resistance to those nematodes in cotton. And it's kind of freed us up to have a little bit of time to really look at corn, the third major crop we have, and see what's going on, because we always knew there were some problems. And I think especially with whatever you want to call it, whether it's global warming or just climate change, we've actually changed when we plant cotton, and we seem to be getting a lot, or when we plant corn and cotton, but we seem to be getting a lot more damage now, and it really has warranted the attention, I think. We've got, in our next slide, we show one of the problems working in corn is it's not just one or two species of nematodes. We've got there's 5 listed on the left. These all in one field or another are what really makes it difficult. Is you can have a field with all 5 of these. I'll show you some data from a field that has all 5 of these nematode species on the left. Individually, they can cause problems. When they occur together, they can cause as much problem or even more problems than when they occur alone. Stubby root, we have them listed in what we consider the order of the most common nematodes across the entire southern United States. So stubby root is probably the most common and probably goes across the biggest range of soil textures. Lesion nematode is very common, and it's hard to work with. It's a nematode that feeds internally in the roots. In the middle of the summer, you may not even be able to recover it from the soil, but it's out there and it's feeding on the roots and causing damage. One of our favorite nematodes from other crops, southern root knot nematode, is not quite as big a problem on corn, we think, but it's hard when you have to separate out the damage from it versus some of the other nematodes. And sting nematode is the one that Anybody who's ever had sting, they know what nematode damage is all about. It only occurs in very coarse textured sandy soils, 95% sand or greater. One or two sting nematodes in about a half a coffee cup, 100 milliliters of soil, can basically severely stunt and almost kill a plant. The bottom one listed there is my favorite, Columbia lance nematode. The Columbia is named for Columbia, South Carolina. It was found just south of the city. This nematode occurs primarily in South Carolina and the edge of the counties along the North Carolina, Georgia borders. It's a very interesting nematode, has a very, very wide host range, as do most of these species, and it loves hot temperatures. It's the warm-blooded nematode that we have here. The three listed on the left, these are very, very common. I think spiral nematode may be the most commonly found nematode across the southern United States in almost every row crop and in many turf fields and that. But fortunately, it has an extremely high threshold before you have to reach really high numbers of spiral nematodes before you can get any damage. So I think with that, Travis is going to walk you through each of the individual species and point out some of the facts about each of those that make it easy or hard to work with.
Yeah, thanks, John. So the first one is stubby root nematode, Paratrichodorus. There's a couple of different species there. This is the common shape of stubby root nematode. Oftentimes, if you're describing someone what to look for, it looks like a cigar when you're looking at it under the microscope. As John mentioned, very common throughout the U.S. corn production, found in quite diverse soil textures. But mostly problematic in those really sandy soils. It does feed ectoparasitically, so it's outside in the soil, feeding on the surface of the root tips, so it can be very damaging when corn is planted early and the roots are emerging slowly, and the stubby root is feeding on those root tips. You can see some significant stunting. The threshold for this is going to be much less than we see for something like lesion or Columbia lance nematodes. And so a lot of the thresholds we'll talk about too are just guides, and they just give you a reference of a starting point, and it's probably going to be different on a field by field basis. This nematode is a little more active at lower soil temperatures than some of the other corn nematodes. So in Arkansas, some of the farmers, they're planting earlier and earlier each year. And of course, the sandy soils are the first to dry out. They're the first to be planted, and sometimes we'll get a drop in temperature and we'll stay colder. The corn is emerging slowly, and those fields that have stubby root, you can see that stunting when the corn next to it takes off as the temperature warms up. Just some of the symptomology here. Really severely stunted plants. You can see by this image here, this is in Jackson County, Arkansas, and it's a very severe population density of stubby root. So it's not the norm. It was really kind of surprising and interesting for me to walk into this field, but it looked like a big bowl. You can see the corn here in the back is normal, and just a couple rows over, it's completely stunted, and these are probably 3 feet tall. They look normal. They've got a tassel, they've got an ear, but it's just a short, smaller version of the hybrid corn. The image here is a good representation of what stunted looks like. Here in the root system here, the root systems look normal. You've got the anchor root starting, and then here this plant was taken from the same field. Of course, you're starting to see a stunted plant, and as well as some of the symptoms you see on the root. These root symptoms are these destructive swellings. I refer to them as starburst. Some others refer to them as kind of the bottle brush appearance, but you can see just on the root tips, that bottle brush or where all those roots are kind of a starburst type symptom. And so that's certainly a good indication of stubby root. That doesn't confirm that stubby root is actually causing that. You would actually need to take a soil sample. But that's what's really severely stunting those plants. All right, we'll move to lesion nematode, Pratylincus, and there's a couple of species that's involved here. It's very common throughout the corn production states, probably the most common. And if you would take any soil sample, regardless of soil texture, you're probably going to find lesion nematode. I know that is the case for me. We have a lot of silt loam soils, and one of the most popular plant parasitic nematodes in corn that comes back is lesion nematode. It can feed, on the root system as well as inside. And one of the classic reasons why it has its name as a lesion nematode is the symptom it causes, and that's these necrotic sunken lesions that's being depicted in this image. Now, not all necrotic lesions on a root system are lesion nematode. Of course, some fungi can be involved, but they can also work synergistically, where lesion comes in as well as the fungi coming afterwards as well. So kind of keep that in mind, but that's kind of the idea of the symptomology that's involved. Southern root knot nematode, again, probably one of the most widespread and common nematode species throughout the southern U.S. Of course, in both of our respective states where you do have cotton or soybeans that are susceptible to root knot, of course, you're not out of any kind of a host. We're not reducing the population density, and those fields it may be more problematic and certainly more common. Almost every cornfield that we plant in, we can certainly find southern root knot nematode. And we really talk about it here more for the subsequent crop that, corn could increase those numbers. It's relatively tolerant, but it still can increase root knot for the subsequent soybean crop. Symptoms, not as dramatic as something like stubby root. You do get some of these smaller galls or spindle-shaped root swellings. Again, they're kind of at the tip here. This is actually a result of the juvenile here, the second stage juvenile, entering the root system, establishing a feeding site, and you do get this swollen root system. But there's certainly a little difference. You don't have that starburst type symptom development. It's just more of a root swelling. And as that plant kind of matures, this seedling is not much different in age. But here it's really hard to see the galls. Actually the egg masses in this case are stained with a red dye, so they're highlighted, but you don't see the galling like you would in corn. I mean, in cotton or soybean. But this image does give you an idea of how much reproduction you can get actually with the southern root knot nematode on corn.
Travis, I'm going to cover Columbia lance and sting nematodes, and they really need to be grouped together because these nematodes are restricted in the areas they occur because they only occur in these very coarse textured sandy soils that are at least 80%. In the case of sting, they really like 90% or greater coarse textured sand. Columbia lance is probably the most important nematode on corn in South Carolina. And one of the reasons for that is corn is an excellent host, but soybean is an excellent host for this, as is cotton. And as we help eliminate some of the other nematode problems on corn and cotton with the host plant resistance that's being developed, this kind of frees up lance nematode from the competition and allows it to infect at even higher rates and probably reproduce and get more of the plant's nutrients. It's a very large nematode compared to a lesion or to a root knot nematode juvenile. It's probably 2 or 3 times larger than they are. So you can see it can consume a considerable amount of energy from the plant. And it also it can feed both ectoparasitically, it can feed endoparasitically, and it can overwinter in the leftover roots. They get kind of a little winter coat of root tissue to protect it. It loves hot temperatures. In the middle of the summer, it's still very active, while a lot of the other nematodes have actually left the roots and are migrating downward. It's a great nematode to work with because it's easy to see, easy to count. But I think it causes as much damage in our area as anywhere. I think the only reason that it isn't more common in Georgia and North Carolina is because peanut is not a host. and in fact will knock these numbers way down in 1 year. So with the immense amount of acreage of peanut in those other two states, I think that's limited the range of Columbia lance nematode. The other nematode I was going to talk to you about is sting nematode, which if Columbia lance nematode is a big nematode, sting nematode is 2 or 3 times bigger. And as you can imagine, is capable of causing more damage. It likes very, very coarse textured soils, sandy soils, and it can do a lot of damage. A threshold for lance, we usually cite 75 per 100 milliliters of soil. With sting nematode, 2 or 3. So it doesn't take many, but it's also normally occurs only in small pockets where this soil texture is right for it. So if you have a 50-acre field, this may only occur in 4 or 5 acres out of that big field, but in that area, it can definitely cause big yield losses. Probably the most damaging nematode per unit, per nematode unit that we have. The large size does mean though that it's easier to get a target nematicide to it. It's a big target. It's easier to hit. But as with Columbia lance, there's no host plant resistance to either of these species. So if we're going to control them, we're going to have to do it through crop rotation. We're going to have to do it through using nematicides. So there's also, I was going to cover 3 other nematodes, stunt, ring, and spiral. These really don't cause a lot of yield loss in corn, but they're extremely common. Spiral nematode is probably the most common nematode that we recover from any of our fields, whether it's a cornfield, a cotton field, a soybean field. We're going to find spiral nematode in there. It occurs in turf grass. It's in almost every field that we have in South Carolina. But fortunately, if we're going to say that sting nematode has a threshold of 2 to 5, and lance has a threshold of 75, spiral nematode is going to have a threshold more around 400 or 500. So we usually don't hit those kind of numbers, see any documentable damage from that. Ring is also it's a wide nematode, and it really does look like, we call them little armadillos in the soil. It's got those rings you can see around the nematode, which means it's very, very restricted in its movements. It likes a coarse textured soil, and it really likes a perennial crop better than it likes our annual row crops. Ring nematode causes a lot of trouble in peaches in South Carolina and things like blueberry and that. Stunt nematode is kind of in between the rest of them. And once again, it takes 200 to 300 to begin to cause any kind of damage in corn. We've got 2 other nematodes I wanted to talk about. We've given you all the bad news. Here's a little bit of good news. The nematodes that you probably hear the very most about next to root knot nematode are reniform nematode and soybean cyst nematode. And neither one of these goes to corn. They just can't feed on it. It's not a host, so they can't damage these crops. And in fact, corn is an excellent rotation crop to knock down the numbers for either reniform or soybean cyst. That's our good news for today. Travis is going to talk to you a little bit about yield estimates, yield loss estimates.
Yes. So whether you're in the northern U.S. or Canada and the South, certainly, as I mentioned before, corn nematodes can impact yield, grain yield. This slide just gives you an idea of the yield losses. This is just the percentage of the total acres in that area. So you can see those are pretty close. You know, with the South, you're looking at 2 to 4% of the corn in the South can be lost due to corn nematodes, and a greater amount, 4 to 6% in the North. So this just really raises awareness of the importance of these nematodes, and of course the diversity there. You really have to understand which nematodes you have is going to be important in some of the management tactics that we get into. But before we get into management, we'll talk a little bit about some of the sampling that actually goes on. After a recent presentation that I gave about corn nematodes in the Mid-South, someone brought me this root system to where I work, and they said, look how bad this stubby root is really just affecting this corn plant. And I said, well, certainly the roots are stubby, but you know, was this actually caused by stubby root? And so we went out back out to the field, took some soil samples around the plants that were stunted or had this symptom, and went as far away as we could to find ones that were not showing this root symptom, and we didn't find any stubby root. So there was a few stunt nematodes, but not enough to cause that kind of damage. Of course, there was some cyst nematodes. It's not causing that. So some things like herbicides or something else physiologically can certainly impact and cause that symptom. So take home point, just because you have stunted, stubby roots doesn't mean it's nematodes, but it's a good time to say, now I need to go out and start sampling to investigate what's actually going on. So if you suspect that you have plants that are stunted, and this happened as well, folks will go out and they're like, my corn's not emerging. We're getting to like V3, V4, and I see spots in the field that are yellow or stunted. Things are not emerging. This is certainly a good time to do a diagnostic sample to diagnose what's actually going on or which corn nematode is actually causing that impact. This is just some general guidelines. Usually I recommend about 15 cores. 15 cores will get you about a pint of soil if you're going about 8 to 10 inches deep. So that's about what most labs want. You don't need any more. Sometimes people send me a gallon. I don't need a gallon, just about a pint, no bigger than what the size of your fist if you mix up that soil really well. But getting deep right around the root zone is going to be certainly important. As I mentioned, sample healthy and stunted plants. Also, take some time to investigate the root system. Do you see that starburst symptom? Do you see stunted roots? What else might be going on there? Depending on if you get your sample back and it's no nematodes, what else could certainly be going on? And then, of course, submitting your sample to a diagnostic lab, avoiding the weekends, sending it there as soon as possible is always going to be important. And using the same lab. I'm not caught up on which one you use, but just go back to the same one. And usually the recommendations they will give you, the closer you can get to where you're growing your corn, they're going to have at least recommendations that are within that state or within that area that are going to be closer to your growing conditions. And usually kind of recommend about V3 to V5, especially remember the root knot. Sometimes you can actually see some of the root swellings at that point. And this is just my arsenal that I usually go out into the field with as far as sampling goes. And next, John's going to talk a little bit more about sampling and some of the experiences to keep in mind as you're going out into the field.
Yeah, Travis talked to you about especially sampling problem areas early in the growing season. And that's very important. That's one way to start a map. If sting nematode only occurs in small pockets, you can pretty much start mapping it out by the samples you take early in the growing season. Those nematodes are there now. They're going to be there toward the end of the year, and they're going to be there next year. They don't move around a lot. They found a nice home, a good soil texture, and they're going to stay there. They don't move a lot horizontally unless they're carried by water or on equipment. But when we talk about thresholds, we're really talking about a sample that's taken in the fall after harvest and used to project where you're going to get a problem the next year in the next year's crop. And so we really want to sample much bigger areas. On the left, if you show the classic sampling method, and one of the things there is you can see where she has the probe. I like to go in even closer. I like to get about 4 inches off the stem of the plant. I like to feel when I put a probe in the ground next to a soybean plant or a corn plant or certainly a cotton plant. I like to feel the roots snapping underneath the probe as it goes in. Where are you going to find a nematode? The same place you find a hungry person. You're going to find them where the food is. And for a nematode, that's the root system. But if sampling with that probe, if you're a typical grower in South Carolina or Arkansas, you have 1,500 to 2,000 acres. You have 30, 40 fields. It would take forever to sample as they do on the left there with the old style probe. On the right, you can see the yellow box on the left side of the gator. I didn't bring a close up with me, but this is an automated sampling system. The probe goes down. You don't have to worry about whether it's somebody like me who weighs 250 pounds pushing down on the probe, or my summer helper who weighs 99 pounds when she's soaking wet. We're going to go down 10 inches deep every time with the hydraulics. We'll get a good sample. We're still going to take the in where the nematode's probably going to be in along a row of plants somewhere close to where the roots are going to snap underneath there. But we've used this automated system. I like it. I can do 20 fields in a day, which is about 18 more than you can probably do with the probe. So it's a very efficient system. But what we like to do on the right, this is typically what you see when you go into a nematode field. This is just 10 acres, but you can see this is soybeans near harvest, and you can see where the nematodes and or the soil is either a poor soil or a high level of nematodes due to the nematode sand combination. So we want to sample in those areas. In this case, it's only 10 acres. You could divide that up into 2 or 3 sections and sample based on that. What I really like to do is to break a field up using a soil texture maps. You can do this on the left. We have a soil electrical conductivity meter. We're getting into some precision ag. We're gonna identify where those white spots are and only put our nematicides. We don't need it in that bottom left corner, but we do need it off to the right. So there's systems that have been designed that we can turn on and off our nematicide application systems and only apply it where we're really getting a yield loss due to the nematodes. And this is true whether it's soybeans or corn or cotton. We have quite a few growers that do this in cotton areas, and they usually wind up only treating about a third of their field. But it's the third that needs the nematicide, and the other 2/3 is going to continue to yield well and be very productive. So it can really save you money just in terms of the amount of nematicides you need to apply to a field. And this works whether it's a 10-acre field or a 100-acre field. I like to see samples. You know, our growers always look at me like I'm crazy, but I'd really like to see areas that are only 20 to 25 acres for a sample. Now, if you really have 2,000 acres, that's a lot of samples. And at $20 a sample, that adds up in a hurry. So we might break a field up into 3 parts, whether it's a 10-acre field or a 50-acre field, but divide it up by obvious breaks in soil texture, whether there's a slope, whether there's differences in drainage. We really don't want to please don't send one sample from a 100-acre field and think that you're going to get a really good answer. And if it's a 100-acre field, I still want to get about 15 or 20 cores and then mix those thoroughly and take a sample. Nematode sampling is there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of room, a lot of leeway to where you're not going to get exact counts. So if someone gives you a nematode report and it says you have 50 Columbia Lance nematodes per 100 milliliters of soil, that's easily plus or minus 10%. When we say the threshold is 50, don't get a report that says 49 and say, I don't have a problem. You really need to look at this as having a pretty good degree of variability and match up the nematode numbers to your knowledge of the history of the yields in that field. And that makes the best model for when to sample.
John, one question about that. We're going to talk about management here in a second. Oftentimes we'll talk about maybe every 4 or 5 years going back in, depending on if you change your production practices, just to see what your populations, how they change. Is that the same thing with corn? Is that what you would recommend in South Carolina?
Yeah, I think you used a really important phrase there. The production practices you have, including the crop that you grew. Next to soil texture, the crop present is the biggest factor affecting the nematode species you have. If you take a field that's full of soybean, if you're in soybean and it has soybean cyst nematode, and you plant corn for 2 years, you're going to drop those cyst nematode numbers way down. But at the same time, you may be increasing your Columbia lax nematode numbers or your stubby root numbers. So I think it's a good idea if you start growing resistant varieties, if you start using a nematicide. Yeah, I would say when you change crops, certainly change or take a sample, get a refresher. And once again, you should probably, if you're making that much effort in the field, you should have a pretty good idea where you're still seeing some yield losses or stunting, and focus on those areas. So yeah,
Yep.
um, unlike soil texture, nematode numbers will fluctuate immensely as you rotate through different crops and different control practices. Even growing a soybean cyst nematode resistant variety versus a susceptible one, it's a good idea to keep up with what's going on in that field, and take a nematode sample then, to make sure what you have going on in the field precisely. We have the next slide is going to show you, these are the thresholds that we talk about, and a lot of states have used 250 centimeters cube soil, or some states use per pint. Make sure that, don't take my numbers and apply them to a state, to a set of samples where they're giving you the numbers per 500 milliliters of soil. Make sure you have that lined up right. They should provide you with that information. But these are relative numbers. As I said, if you get a sample back that says you have 30 stubby root nematodes, and you have another one that has 29, the odds are they're both going to get some damage. These are not absolutes, especially when you get into these higher numbers. And what these two columns represent, loamy sand versus sandy loam. A sandy loam is a better soil. You're going to be growing a healthier plant. It's not predisposed to yield loss as it would be if there was a sandier soil. So it takes more nematodes to cause damage. And you can see that stubby root, this is a really insidious little nematode. You can sample it pre-plant and find it. You can sample a little bit after planting and find it. And then in the middle of the summer, if you go out and sample, you may not find any. Nematodes are amazing in their ability to migrate vertically, up to 3 feet, 2 to 3 feet. And as I tell all my growers, we don't know what goes on below 10 inches in most fields, because any grower who tells me they've sampled more than 10 inches deep, I'm going to politely tell them that they're telling me a fib. Nobody, unless you're using a hydraulic probe, is able to go more than 10 inches deep and take a sample. So you can see these numbers in Arkansas and South Carolina. Our thresholds are a little bit lower in some of these fields, some of these soil textures. It's a good idea that when you first start doing this, to get with your county agent or a consultant and have them walk you through this. If you take soil samples, I guarantee you, if you're over on the eastern half of the South, I'll be glad to work with you. If you take the time to take the samples, I'll be more than happy to take the time to help interpret them. And I'm sure Travis would tell you the same thing. If you're in Arkansas,
I agree with
Mississippi, Louisiana, if you take the time to sample, we'll take the time to help walk you through it. And if we run into any little local specialties, we'll call your local. Every state now has a pretty good nematologist in it. And most of the states, I believe, Travis, have a nematode lab. And the fees vary. In Arkansas, they've got a program for soybeans, where they'll run them basically for free. And I do the same thing here. We get grant money from the different commodity groups, and we'll run your samples. If you're from South Carolina, I'll run most of your samples for free, and then help you interpret them. So, but you can see there's an immense difference in the number of stubby root it takes to cause damage versus something like sting, which you're probably not going to find in Arkansas. And if that is one where if you find any, you're going to have a problem. Of course, you're already in a field that's 90% sand and probably has yield limited in what you can produce. So that's thresholds are a great tool to project what's going on in your next crop, not even help you choose what crop to grow the next time around. So that's what we wanted to talk about there. Um, there are factors that affect these damage thresholds. Um, on an individual field basis, the sandier it is, the lower the threshold, because the plants are predisposed to damage. They're probably under in our area, they're going to be under moisture stress when we get in these high sands. You can imagine 80% sand, as we talked about earlier, in the Midwest, in your good dark soils. If it rains an inch, you don't get in the field for a week. Here in South Carolina with 80% sand, if it rains an inch today, I'll probably be in the field tomorrow afternoon or the next morning. So the plants undergo a lot of more stress here from moisture than they would in a lot of other soil types. Soil temperature, this is something that's really going to vary between species. And it's something I guess we really don't have a strong handle on. We think most of the nematodes don't become active until about 58 degrees. I think Fahrenheit. Columbia lance is probably even higher than that, but it gives you an idea of what's going on. Now, most of the nematodes also cut out. They become inactive, and if they can, they'll migrate down into the soil to find a cooler soil temperature. Most nematodes aren't very happy when it gets above 90 degrees, I think. But they've already done the damage. One of the golden rules, I guess, that we haven't pointed out here is that most nematode damage is done in the first month of the growing season. And it's very difficult for plants to compensate for that damage. That's one of the reasons I think a lot of us felt we weren't seeing as much damage on corn as we did on cotton and soybean, because those are very, very strong taproot oriented plants. A few nematodes feeding on the growing point of the taproot of a cotton plant can stun it and set it back a month. Whereas with corn, you don't have a real taproot. You have all these brace roots and extra roots that come out 30 days into the growing season and can compensate in a hurry for the damage the nematodes may have done in that first week or two. So there's just a lot of interactions that you have to deal with all these nematodes. But the bottom line is, if they're out there at high enough numbers, you're going to have a problem, and you probably need to deal with it. And the management options, Travis is going to cover those for us and talk about what you might want to, the options you may or may not have based on your the nematodes that you do have.
Sure. Yeah. So we just kind of got these, there's several of them. There are cultural practices. Of course, I mentioned with stubby root, sometimes the planting date. The field here in this image was as a result of stubby root damage. They came in actually because they got seed to plant back for free. They put a disc in this and then replanted it with no damage afterward. Like John said, sometimes that temperature starting to get up, the corn comes out quicker, and the damage from the stubby root is less. You don't have to wait for weeks and weeks, but wait until soil temperature is up a little higher can be helpful. And we have farmers in Arkansas who are now doing that. Of course, a good root system is also helpful to mitigate any of the losses there. So in-furrow tillage can certainly be helpful. And of course, looking at some of the other inputs that you have, you're not going to irrigate your way out of this, and you're not going to fertilize your way out of it. And of course, if you do have a nematode issue, what is the cost for those inputs too? And so is those aren't going to get you through, but certainly keeping in mind those are added cost. And so what kind of cost benefit analysis am I getting from that is something to kind of keep in mind. We have a slide next that will talk about a little bit more about crop rotation. Unfortunately, it's not as good as other crops. It's kind of like the same when I'm talking about southern root knot nematode options in the Mid-South. Almost everything's a host, and most of these nematode species have a really broad host range. Host plant resistance is minimal at best. There's so many different hybrids that come out. They're usually in and out in 3 years. So getting data on that is really a challenge. Most of us do not screen corn hybrids just because of that. They change over so quickly. But even those that have looked at breeding lines in the past, the resistance is minimal. We're probably referring to more tolerance. The plants are able to compensate for the feeding, able to produce a crop, but in some severe cases, like the image here, there's no really host plant resistance. And the nematicides, we're going to go a little more detail about that earlier. There's certainly some more options. When I first started as an extension plant pathologist, there were very few in corn. Now there's more options, so we'll take a little bit more time to dive into that. I'll just kind of hit this point as far as our crop rotation. Um, we've highlighted the ones there that can be helpful, and of course, that's just peanut. So that is a non-host for the southern root knot nematode, as well as the Columbia lance nematode. Of course, if you have the peanut root knot nematode, of course, it's going to reproduce on peanuts. So that's something else to know which species you have. If you're in the mid-south, typically we have mostly incognitas, the southern root knot nematode. As you get towards the southeast and the Carolinas, of course, they have more diversity within their root knot nematode species than we have. So again, you may have to dive into that a little bit further, or get with the extension plant pathologist or nematologist in those areas to provide a little bit more information. But certainly, corn is a host to everything we talked about, cotton, soybean, and that covers a lot of the crops that's also covered within CPN, and as well as interest for most of the audience here. And of course, grain sorghum being very similar to corn as a host. So limited options, but again, just want to show the facts of what's available. There is some rotation that can help. This is specifically with the southern root knot nematode. Again, a lot of research has gone into mitigating losses, especially in soybean. Each year, my program evaluates soybean varieties for resistance to the southern root knot nematode. Here's a variety. There's limited galling. These are actually nodules. And of course, here you can see the extensive galling by the southern root knot nematode. In cotton, there's probably a greater advancement made recently where some of those varieties will really knock down the numbers for the subsequent cropping season. In some areas, like in the southeast, where we're growing some of the later maturity groups, anything past a 5, there's certainly more options here. What I'm looking at is some maturity group 4s, and they're very limited. And again, the varieties don't last long, so you definitely want to get with the local researchers in that area to find the best options for that region. Of course, the idea here is we're trying to reduce the inoculum carryover for the subsequent cropping season. But certainly these are maybe just a little bit of light in a dark world of crop rotation. But these are certainly some options that we can have. This is a really interesting point. I'm gonna let John take over this with some of the data he had in South Carolina, but some of the volunteer corn after we harvest corn. John, I'm surprised about how much volunteer corn is out there, and then how far it can grow in a season before the freeze comes in and kills it off.
Yeah, we're in South Carolina. We, of course, we're whereas in the upper Midwest, you're looking at the logistics of planting corn and soybeans in the same year. A lot of our growers are planting corn, then they plant peanuts, then they plant cotton, and then they plant soybeans. So they're managing 4 different crops at once. And they plant corn very early because they want to get it out really early, because the money is in the peanuts and the cotton. But we'll be harvesting our corn crop starting in the middle of August and hopefully be done by the middle of September. We don't get a killing frost anymore until almost the middle of November. So we have 2 or 3 months to grow another crop out there. And unfortunately, it's either the volunteer corn or even weeds. There's most of the weeds that occur commonly, even pigweed, nutgrass. These are all hosts to most of these nematode species. So a lot of our growers have, I joke with them that they're double cropping. Unfortunately, it's corn and a weed host. And these are just increasing and helping the nematodes to survive. A lot of our growers have actually gone to trying to destroy these, let these come up, grow for a couple weeks, 2, 3 weeks. Once the nematodes are in the roots, then they go through and they destroy the plant and use this kind of like a trap crop, and are actually killing off, turning a negative into a positive. But a lot of them also don't have a lot of time to do that. So we have to be careful because you can see on this little chart, the stubby root are already over the fall threshold for the next year. And the Columbia lance are about a third of the way there. So we need to try and manage this situation to the best we can. And on the farther south you go, I think the more important this is, because if you get down toward the coast in Georgia and Florida and that, I've been told there's places that never get a killing frost. So they're basically growing nematodes year round. With that, we want to talk a little bit about what we can do for nematodes. We've talked about how difficult it is to rotate. There's so many crops that are hosts. There's very little resistance within any of our crops to the nematodes like stubby root, lesion, and lance, and sting. There's no resistance, so we're really backed into a corner where we have to use nematicides. And of course, every time we start to talk about this, we want to be very, very confident that we need them, because it's an added expenditure to the grower. You're going to see most of these nematicides are going to cost a minimum of $20 to $30 per acre. That's why I brought up earlier that perhaps we can map these fields and do some precision application only in the areas that really need it. I'm going to talk a little bit about telone. I think this is probably one of the oldest nematicides we have that's still labeled. It's a fumigant. It comes in a liquid. You inject it down in furrow. You're supposed to have a 7 to 10 day pre-plant interval before you would plant, because it is phytotoxic to seed if the telone gas is still coming up underneath it. So we want to try to avoid planting right away. But if you use telone 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of people, it was what most people would say flat out is a pain in the rear to apply, because it is a liquid. You put it down into the soil. You have to run in furrow subsoil shanks. And if you spill any of it on you, if you get some on you, it will burn. It will burn you somewhat. Usually not severely, but it's not a happy day when you get telone on you. It's not acutely toxic, but it definitely will burn, and you'll have what's a rash for 2 or 3 days even. What they have now is totally enclosed systems where it would be very difficult to be exposed to the telone itself. And where he has the arrow, that's actually a nitrogen tank. And we're using nitrogen to push the telone out of the big white tank. And we can, by controlling the nitrogen pressure and the orifice size, we can control the rates of the telone that's going down into the soil. In the past, it was just a big open system. You had an orifice, you changed the orifice and the speed of the tractor, and it was almost black magic to get the right amount to go out. But now it's very precise, and you can turn this on and off as you go through the field. As I said, we have growers in the southern part of our state, mostly cotton growers with telone, trying to deal with the root knot nematode problem. But they basically, some of them told me, John, it's pretty cheap. I know my fields. I know where the problem areas are. I have an on-off switch. I treat about a third of the field. So that's something you might want to consider. The rate is 3 to 5 gallons per acre. I think it would be a very rare case when anybody would put down 5 gallons of telone in a cornfield, because it's $20 a gallon. And once again, I would think that you would really want to look at one of these variable rate application systems before you go after that. But as you can see in this picture, we get a pretty good response. We can control a lot of nematodes with telone. It's been a very reliable nematicide for years and years. There is a limitation to it. You can't buy 5 gallons of telone. You can't buy 10 gallons of telone. You have to buy those 110-gallon tanks. So if you divide that by 3 gallons per acre, you're going to have to want to treat at least 30 acres and do it in increments of 30 acres so that you can justify buying that entire tank and using it at $20 a gallon. You don't want to leave it in the tank and waste it. So with that, we're going to switch. Travis is going to talk to you about the other older nematicide, which is Counter.
Yeah. So for the Mid-South, something like Telon is not so much of an option. By the time it stops raining, farmers are ready to get in the field and they're going to plant as quickly as possible. So that the plant timing after the application is not as lucrative. But something like Counter, certainly, as John mentioned, an old organophosphate nematicide, Turbifos. Now things again, lock and load system safer. You don't touch the materials. You actually just lock it into the applicator, kind of like the old insect boxes, but everything is contained. You never really touch it. You just return the box and they give you back on what you didn't use, money back. Again, something too to mention about nematicides, we should take a time here is that, you're going to get the protection for that 1 year. It really doesn't carry over so much for the following season. So you just basically have that 1 year of return. So when you look at your cost benefit analysis, certainly keep that in mind. The rate is up to 6.5 pounds per acre. Almost everybody who uses this usually uses that rate. And again, AMVAC is helpful coming out with some of the different systems and are helping getting this calibrated. So you're not doing this alone, as just as a farmer by yourself. Cost, here's kind of a range, again, kind of in that $20 to $25 range. I'm sure depending on what you buy, there's always different rebates and things too, but that's certainly a general idea of cost based on some of our interaction with farmers. The only restriction use and issue is some of these ALS herbicides. Kind of an interaction with that nematicide can cause certainly some stunting in some of the corn. So certainly keep that in mind if you're using that in an ALS program is something you're going to use in your cornfield. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. Most people who use it are aware of it and usually really don't have any problems. So I wouldn't avoid it because of that. Just be aware of it. Some of the newer nematicides that have come up in the last couple of years, the one here is vellum. The active ingredient is an SDHI fungicide, fluopyram. This is sold on various seed treatments in cotton and as well in soybean. And vellum has been under different names, Vellum 1, Vellum Total, but this is just vellum now. And it's the one that is marketed for use in corn. This goes out as an in-furrow, like all of these Counter to. It's an in-furrow, that's the seed furrow. So here you can see the applicator. Here's the seed firmer, so the seed opener. This is probably a flat fan nozzle oriented, perpendicular to the seed furrow, so it's along the length. And we use about 6 gallons per acre, so you're not carrying a whole lot of water. And then the rate is 6.5 fluid ounces per acre. So it helps to distribute that the nematicide within that seed furrow right over the top of the seed. In soybeans, there's some phytotoxicity on the seed. I've not seen any in corn. Here's the cost. Again, we're looking somewhere in that $30 per acre. If you're using that full rate of 6.5 ounces per acre. If you're looking at the lower rate, there's a 2EE label that has 3 fluid ounces per acre. So those are certainly options, new options that we have, and this particular product has only a caution label. So we're getting to nematicides that have a little bit more safer use when it comes to the applicator and the end user. And this again is marketed by Bayer Crop Science. Another product also marketed by Bayer Crop Science is Propulse. This has the nematicide fluopyram with a fungicide, FRAC code 3 or a triazole, prothioconazole. In soybeans, this would be Proline or one of the active ingredients in Stratego YLD or Delarno. The rate again in furrow is 4 to 8 ounces. The amount of fluopyram in this 8 ounces is about 3 ounces of vellum. So it kind of gives you an idea. I'll show you some of my data that kind of makes a comparison between those two. The only restriction that we wanted to put on here to make you aware of, sometimes, especially with corn production, there's a lot of fertilizers that go out at planting or micronutrients. Adding this as a liquid material in the tank with liquid fertilizers and micronutrients can be problematic, can cause some clogging of nozzles. So just be kind of conscious of that. In my program, and as far as research trials, we've avoided these nozzles. In my area, we have some more silt looms. You set the planter down, they can kind of get plugged. You can just use a micro tube, and they're less problematic about getting plugged, although that's not going to mitigate the plugging from the fertilizers or the micronutrients in the tank with Propulse. The last one is again, a nematicide we're very familiar with for a number of years. This is abamectin, and this is sold as Avid as a seed treatment, but this is a liquid in-furrow material again, and this is Averland by Crop Protection. This is the rate, 4 to 7 fluid ounces, again, in-furrow at planting, application, and the label really refers to as nematode suppression. And so it's out, it's available. I know some of our farmers have been looking at it, and I've looked at it in a couple of my trials. And so I think for the next couple of slides, we're going to look at some of our trial data and show you what our experiences have been with some of these nematicides. And so first, I believe, oh, nope, I'm going to mention a little bit more about the seed treatments first. This is probably the biggest group that's available over the past few years, especially to farmers, because it's already on the seed coat, which makes it really user friendly. You don't have to carry any water or any different applications. So the chemical Avicta, abamectin, I already mentioned. The rest of them that have been coming on is a lot of these biological materials. Votivo has been around for the longest. This is Bacillus firmus, so this is a kind of a living organism. It has to grow and develop along the root system to provide protection. The other bacilli, the amyliquafaciens, Innoveo EZ and Luminalza with Corteva is also a living organism. The Bacillus amyliquafaciens in Trinimco is really marketed more of a fungicide, so that tells you a lot of the diversity within some of these bacilli. Within Trinimco, it's the cis jasmine stimulates an SAR, systemic acquired resistance, or induced systemic resistance in the corn plant to provide some protection. And the other one here, the heat-killed Burkholderia rhinogensis from Albaugh is basically dead material, so it's not living. So it's really more of a chemical type material, has to wash off the seed coat and get into the soil to provide that protection to the root system. And so again, these are very popular, and some of these are only available by the companies, like with Corteva and some of the Pioneer, whereas the BioST nematicide 100 and Trinimco in our areas can be applied downstream. So with that, we're going to talk about some of our nematicide trials for the past couple of years. And John, it looks like you're up first with some of the trials.
Okay. Yeah, I want to reinforce something that Travis said a little bit earlier, and that is, you remember I talked about these nematicides. We're trying to protect the root system for the first 30 days. And usually in that length of time, we're going to have most of the roots that a plant's going to develop. Although I think corn continues to develop a little longer than cotton or soybean. But the nematicides are not there all year long, and they're not going to suppress the nematodes all year long. In fact, with a lot of these, you'll see good suppression for, say, the first 30 to 45 days. But then at the end of the year, you'll actually see more nematodes somewhere that you've treated with something like a counter than you do even in the check, because you've provided a healthy root system, which is where nematodes can feed later in the year. They're not causing as much damage because the roots are there and they're bringing in the nutrients and the water the plant needs, but they're also allowing nematodes to feed and reproduce. So that's one of the reasons this resurgence at the end of the year is one of the reasons that nematicides are a 1 year cure or a 1 year benefit, and the next year you basically start over. Is what's going to happen. This is from 2021. It's a field right next to the one I've been showing you at the very start of the talk, where we had the telone next to the check. It's very sandy soil, and I've included the nematode counts here because in this field we had lesion, root knot, and Columbia lance, and you can see these are fairly high numbers. You can see that's also you just don't get as high a number of lesion as you do say root knot or lance. But we got pretty good control of the nematodes, but getting it at the end, getting a good strong yield response that can I don't want to that can justify a $20 or $30 an acre expense can be quite hard, at least on a trial basis. I'll show you my last test of what I really think is going to happen. But you can see these numbers. It's just there's so much variability. We use plots that are 4 rows, 40 to 50 feet long, and even amongst those in an acre, you get a huge amount of variability. So it's difficult to show that yield response in the end. I did the same test basically the next year. I did it twice, side-by-side tests, just across the road from each other. And one thing I wanted to point out, these are not 300 bushel fields. This is most of our growers, if we could get between 175 and 200 bushels, would be ecstatic. And these are typical fields in South Carolina. The one on the right doesn't have quite the yield potential of the one on the left. And you can see that there's 180 in the check. We did get up to 190 with 5 gallons of telone, but we spent quite a bit of money to get there. I think this field also had lance, stubby root, lesion, sting nematodes. We put them in the acid test and found out it's pretty hard to control these nematodes in terms of justifying the money for a nematicide. Now, are we getting yield loss due to nematodes on corn? The next slide will show you what I think is happening. Now, this is a field that's fairly sandy. It's basically going to be 125 bushel field, maybe 150 in a good year. But you can see we looked when we applied 5 gallons per acre of telone, which is kind of like whatever you want to call it, the Cadillac treatment. It's as good as you can get. We're looking at 39 bushel yield increase. So that's really significant. And here we had 12 replications. So it takes a while, but you can see that there's a very strong trend there. The nematodes really are causing damage. It's just very difficult in these nematicide trials to get a good solid result that you can statistically see differences. I think Travis is going to show you that his somewhat similar results.
Yeah, exactly, John. So this was a trial we had in 2021, Jackson County. It's the central part of Arkansas, a very sandy field, and this is in a farmer's field, so off the station. And so we were really trying to see with this farmer what kind of impact some of these nematicides were going to have. This is just more of a visual, just to give you an idea of things we had, maybe different than John. The Averland, a lot of the biological seed treatments, the chemicals here, abamectin on the seed and in furrow, and then several of the vellum treatments, similar rates all the way through here. Again, these 2 rates here with vellum and propulse would have the same amount of fluopyram. You have the additive with the prothioconazole, and then some of the different combinations that we thought may be working downstream with some of the farmers. What would be the best thing we could do for these non-fumigants? And then for us, the standard would be counter. I mentioned earlier in this presentation about soil temperatures. This field has a good population of stubby root. And this is typical what happens. This line is really kind of the infection for the southern root knot nematode at 65 degrees, according to some of the reports. So that's where the blue line is at. But you can see when we planted, it was the soil temperature was 66 degrees, and then it dropped, and it stayed relatively cold. And this is in that area that John was mentioning, that something like stubby root is going to be still pretty active, and probably more active than something like root knot, of course, in our field. And then, of course, the temperature comes up. So let's see how this performed under what I would call an advantage for the nematode. How did the nematicide stack up? So we have a loamy sand field. So again, relatively sandy. This was a deeper sand. If you put the probe down 12 inches, it is all sand. We sampled at 0, 41, and at harvest. So right after we harvested, looked at that analysis, and there was not a lot of difference among treatments. So each one of these bars actually represents the data from among those 3 sample timings. My non-treated control, we'll just start with the blue bar first. Everything looked like it reduced root knot. Of course, this would be southern root knot, not so much with Evicta, but everything else, you're at least getting a trend, not statistically different, but a trend. Stubby root next. Here's our non-treated control. All the biologicals, again, numerically less. The abamectin materials, whether seed treatment or in furrow, not so much. And then our vellum treatments with and without a seed treatment, numerically lower. Only one with the Trinimco material with vellum was statistically lower, along with counter. And we saw basically the same trend when it came to lesion as well. So surprisingly, usually I don't see a reduction, kind of like what John was mentioning, but in this case we did. How did that compare to the yield? That's probably the most important part. Here, a little different than what John was mentioning. Here, the corn yield potential here in this field was really good, 220. Pretty happy with that. We saw a reduction again with some of the biologicals. Don't really have a good answer for what's actually going on there. The abamectin materials were at least close to the average, with the Evicta being above. Again, these are just trends. So it's really hard to see a lot what's going on with trends, but you look at enough of them, you kind of get an idea of how these might work. Here's our vellum materials, not so much going on there. Now, I will say right after this was planted, along with that cool temperatures came cold rain. So did this move some of the materials away from the root zone, out further past where we were getting protection? Not sure. We didn't go back in and sample for that, but you can see here with counter, it's a common trend that we've seen in a lot of our trials. Numerically, we're seeing more positive with it than negative. And then here, what do we have? 20 bushel difference. Even at $4 corn, that counter is going to pay for itself. So with this past year corn prices, that certainly would have been profitable, and that farmer would have been happy with that. Actually, this farmer actually puts out a lot of counter in his fields, and this is part of the reason why they definitely see a positive response with it. But again, he's applying it every year. So just some closing thoughts. We hope you found this information to be insightful and helpful as we transverse the challenging world of corn nematodes. Again, most presentations will talk about one pathogen or one disease, and here we have to talk about several species of plant parasitic nematodes, and which ones are important and where, and certainly a couple of those are important across the U.S. cotton belt. Of course, corn nematodes are very difficult to identify based on plant symptoms, and we hope we gave you some ideas on when to sample, maybe how to sample, how you might want to change your sampling system, and certainly following the systems approach on where the nematodes are going to follow the crop. As your crop production system changes, so should your sampling for corn nematodes. And the variability within the nematicides on being consistent, especially the non-fumigants. Of course, we showed that in a couple of our trials. I think that would be something that would be also observed in other states. As we do this a few more years, maybe we'll see some more trends that'll come out and have some more solid recommendations. But with that, if you have any questions, and you want to reach out to either of us, here's our email addresses, and we're more than happy to talk about corn nematodes. Probably tell you more than you actually want to know, but we're certainly glad to do that. And I'll give the last comment. John, do you want to say anything else?
Just it's a really complicated situation. Your best weapon against these nematodes and yield losses is knowledge, and that knowledge comes from taking soil samples and having a history in your fields and putting those two things together so that we know what really is nematode damage, what perhaps is due to something else, as we said, stubby root symptoms could be caused by some herbicides or various problems. But get out there and take some samples and see what you got. And if it's a nematode situation, we'll work with you and maybe help you develop a long-term plan, a rotation scheme, both between crops and even varieties within a crop that maybe can help you control these things.
Excellent. With that, thank you for your time.